Robert listed the lake house for $2,400,000 on a Tuesday, and I was standing at Helen's grave when the real estate agent left the message on my phone. That was how I knew my son had not read the trust. It was the first Tuesday of March. I go on the first Tuesday of every month. Helen knew I would. The cemetery sits on a low rise outside town, and there is a bench under a sycamore about 20 paces from her stone. I was telling her about the dogwood thinking about flowering, the way I tell her every March, when the phone went off in my pocket. I did not answer it. I listened to the voicemail later, sitting in the truck with my hand on the steering wheel and the watch on my wrist ticking the way it has ticked for 37 years. A young woman, polite, professional. She was confirming the walkthrough at the lake house for Thursday. She thanked Robert for choosing her firm. She said she was looking forward to meeting the family. I did not call my son. I sat in the parking lot a long time. Then I drove home and made one phone call, and after that, I waited. Some of you watching already know what I am going to tell you. The deed had been in that drawer since 1987. It was still there. If you have ever seen someone mistake age for weakness, stay with me. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe to my channel for more stories like this, because old hands still know where the records are kept. My name is Walter. I am 74 years old. I was a county judge for 28 years before I retired, and before that I was a country lawyer, and before that I was a boy on a tobacco farm outside Lynchburg who learned to read by candlelight when the power went out, which was often. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because a man who learns to read carefully when he is small tends to read carefully when he is old, and that habit, more than anything else, is what saved the lake house. My wife's name was Helen. We were married 46 years. She passed in the fall of 1989, 4 months and 11 days after the diagnosis. I am not going to walk you through that part of it. I will only say that the morning of her funeral, my son Robert, who was 22 and home from law school, stood at the kitchen window with his hands in his pockets and told me he did not know how I was going to manage. I told him I would manage the way people manage. He nodded the way young men nod when they are not really listening. He did not become a lawyer in the end. He became a man who works in something called asset management, in an office in Richmond with glass walls and a view of the river. He is a good man in many ways. He is also a man who has been measuring my house, in his head, for a long time. The lake house sits on 12 acres of shoreline outside Charlottesville. We bought the land in 1978, the year Robert was 4 and his sister Margaret was 7. Helen had grown up summering on a lake in Michigan, and she said she wanted our children to know what it felt like to fall asleep with the windows open and hear the water. I built the dock myself. I did not do a perfect job of it. There is a board near the end that still does not lie flat, and every time I walk over it, the toe of my boot catches, and I think about the August afternoon in 1981, when I cut that board too short, and Helen laughed at me from the porch and said, "Leave it, Walter. That is the board your grandchildren are going to remember." She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. I want to take a minute on the dock, because the dock is where most of what mattered in our family happened. Margaret learned to swim off the end of it the summer she turned 8, with her mother in the water beside her saying, "Breathe, baby, breathe." And Robert was 4 and stood on the shore in a yellow life vest, hollering at his sister to come back. The first sunfish I ever caught with Robert on a line was caught off that dock. The first time I ever saw Margaret kiss the boy she would not end up marrying was on that dock. The morning Helen and I sat with the doctor's letter in our hands in the summer of 1989, we drove up to the lake house and we sat on that dock until the sun went down, and we did not say much, because there was not much that needed saying. The water did the work for us. It does that, if you give it time. In 1989, when she got sick, Helen sat me down at the kitchen table here in town and slid a folder across to me. She had been to a lawyer in Charlottesville, an old friend of her father's, and she had asked him to draw up papers on the lake house. She did not call it a trust at first. She called it a fence, She said, "Walter, I want a fence around it." I asked her what she was afraid of, and she gave me the look she gave me when I was being slow on purpose. She said, "You spent 30 years protecting strangers in that courtroom. The least we can do is protect what we built." I signed the papers. The lawyer she chose became my lawyer after that, a man named Edmund Hollis, and his son, Edmund Jr., is the one I deal with now. The trust was filed in early summer of 1989. Helen's diagnosis came that fall. The terms were simple, the way Helen liked things. The lake house went into an irrevocable trust. The trustee was me. The property could not be sold, transferred, or borrowed against by any party other than the named trustee, which meant me and only me. The beneficiaries on paper were the children, Margaret and Robert, but the document was clear. Until the trustee moved or died, the door was the trustee's door. Helen read it twice before she signed. She corrected one comma. Then she put the cap back on her pen and said, "All right, Walter, that is the fence." She did not bring it up again. I remember the pen she used. It was a blue ballpoint with the name of a feed store in Lynchburg printed up the side, the kind of pen you find loose in a kitchen drawer next to rubber bands and old keys. Helen was not a sentimental woman about objects. She would sign the most important paper of her life with the first pen that came to her hand, and she would put it back in the drawer when she was done, and she would not think twice about it. That was her way. The fence mattered. The pen did not. I think about that sometimes when I'm putting the watch on in the morning. The watch is fine. The fence is what matters. The lawyer, old Edmund Sr., was a quiet man with hands that had spotted with age and a courtroom voice that had gone soft over the years. He looked at Helen across his desk that afternoon, and he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that what you are doing today is a kindness to your husband, even if it does not feel that way." Helen said, "Edmund, I know what it is." He smiled at her and stamped the seal, and that was that. We drove home that evening. Helen made meatloaf. I cleaned up. The papers went into the drawer. 4 months later, the doctor told us what the doctor told us, and a year after that, Helen was buried under the sycamore where the bench is now, and the papers were still in the drawer, and they have been in the drawer since. I want to tell you something about that trust, because it matters for what comes later. I never made a secret of it. Both children received a copy of the document the year after Helen passed. I sat them down in this kitchen on a December afternoon, and I told them what their mother had done and why. Margaret read it slowly and asked 2 intelligent questions and then folded her copy and put it in her purse and never spoke of it again. Robert did not read his copy in front of me. He took it back to law school in his bag, and a few months later, at Christmas, when I asked him if he had any questions about it, he said, "What? Oh, that thing? No, it is fine, Dad." That was the first time I knew they had stopped seeing me. It is a small thing, that moment. He was 23, he was busy. I have been a young man myself, and I know what it is like to fold a letter from your father into a drawer because you intend to read it later and never do. I did not hold it against him then. I do not hold it against him now. But I made a small note in my head that afternoon, the way a judge makes a small note in the margin, and I never quite erased it. Years went on. The children grew up. I want to say something about Margaret here, because Margaret is part of why I was patient with Robert when I was patient with him. Margaret called me every Sunday for 35 years. She still does. She does not call to check on me exactly. She calls to talk. She tells me about her patients. She tells me about her girls. Sometimes she puts David on the phone, and David and I talk about whatever ball game is on. Margaret has never once asked me about the lake house in a way that suggested she was thinking of it as a thing to be sold. She has asked me about the dock. She has asked me about the back room where her grandmother's quilt is folded in the cedar chest. She has asked me whether I want her to come down and help me close it up for the winter, the way Helen and I used to close it up together. She has not asked me, in 36 years, whether I had thought about letting it go. The difference between the 2 children is not that one is good and the other is bad. The difference is that one of them sees the place and the other one sees a number on a page. I love them both. I am their father. But I am not blind. Margaret became a nurse and married a kind man named David, and moved out to Roanoke and had two daughters who, when they were small, used to run out onto that uneven dock at the lake house in their bare feet and dare each other to jump first. Robert married a woman named Caroline, who I respect, and they had one son, Tyler, who is 15 now and looks at his phone the way men of my generation looked at the horizon when we were waiting for weather to come in. Helen would have loved every one of those grandchildren. She would have laughed at Tyler and his phone, and she would have said, "Walter, leave him alone. He is figuring it out the same way Robert figured out his Walkman." I miss her every day. I do not say that for show. I say it because it is the simple truth, and the simple truth is what I built my life on. Now, about 6 months before the listing, about the dinner. It was September. Robert and Caroline came down for the weekend, and we ate in the dining room, the four of us, because Tyler was off at a friend's house playing one of his games. Caroline had brought a roast and she had brought a bottle of wine, and the conversation was easy for a while. We talked about Margaret's older girls starting at William and Mary. We talked about the new bypass they are putting in north of town. We talked about whether the dogwood was going to flower early. Then Robert said across the table to Caroline, in a voice that was not quite low enough, "You know, that lake house just sits empty most of the winter, and it is not like Dad goes up there alone anymore." He did not say it to me. He said it across me, the way you say a thing across a child at the dinner table when you do not want the child to hear, only I am not a child. And the table is not that wide, and my hearing has been good my whole life. I did not look up from my plate. I cut a piece of the roast, and I chewed it carefully, and I swallowed. And then I asked Caroline how the bread was, because the bread was very good. Caroline said the bread was wonderful, and she gave Robert a small look that I caught out of the corner of my eye, and Robert moved his fork around the plate and changed the subject to something about a restaurant in Richmond. That was the first red flag. I did not call it a red flag at the time. I called it a young man being careless. But I went to bed that night, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about that sentence for a long time. And I thought about how he had said anymore, like he was finishing the sentence of a thought he had been having for months. The old file was not forgotten. It was waiting. 2 weeks after that dinner, Edmund Hollis Jr. called me at the house. He is not a man who calls without reason. He said, "Walter, I want to tell you something, and I would rather tell you on the phone than in a letter." Robert had called his office twice in the previous month, asking general questions about the lake house and the trust. Robert had referred to Edmund as our family attorney, in a way that suggested Robert believed Edmund was also his attorney, which Edmund is not. Edmund had been polite. Edmund had not given Robert any information. Edmund had waited 2 days after the second call, and then he had called me, because that is what an honest lawyer does. I thanked him. I asked him what specifically Robert had asked. Edmund said the questions were general at first, who held what the conditions were, and then on the second call, a little more specific, was the trust revocable? What would it take to dissolve it? What was the process if the trustee chose to step down? Edmund had not answered any of it. Edmund had said only that he would need to speak with the trustee directly about any matter related to the trust. I sat in this chair, by this window, with the phone against my ear, and I looked at the watch on my wrist, the Longines Helen gave me for our 30th anniversary in 1973. The second hand was making its slow walk around the face, the way it has been making its slow walk for 53 years. I told Edmund thank you, and I told him I would handle it from my end, and I asked him to keep me informed. Then I hung up, and I sat there for a long time. That was the second red flag. Some of you are getting ahead of me, and I do not blame you. You are thinking, "Walter, why did you not call him? Why did you not pick up the phone right then and ask your son what he was doing?" I will tell you why. I have spent my whole life in courtrooms, watching what happens when people speak before they are ready. I have watched men lose cases they should have won because they could not bear to be quiet for 48 hours. I am not that kind of man, and I was not going to become that kind of man at 73, when my son was making a mistake that he had not yet finished making. Helen used to say, "Walter moves slowly because he is careful, not because he is weak." She said that to her sister once when her sister was getting impatient with me at a Christmas dinner. I never forgot it. They thought I moved slowly because I was weak. I moved slowly because I was careful. About 3 weeks after the call from Edmund, I got a text message from a man named Carl Truitt, who has the cabin 2 doors down from the lake house. Carl is 78 and a retired electrician, and one of the most observant human beings I have ever known. Carl does not text often. When Carl texts, it is usually a photograph and 3 words. The photograph showed a silver sedan parked in my driveway at the lake house on a Thursday afternoon in October. The car had a small magnetic sign on the driver's door, and you could read the agency name if you looked at the picture closely, which I did. It was a real estate firm out of Charlottesville. Carl's 3 words were, "Who is this?" I wrote back, "No one I sent." I asked him if he had seen anyone go inside. He said, "2 of them, a man and a woman, in there about 20 minutes, looked around the dock, took photographs, drove off." He asked if he should call anybody. I told him no, thank you. I would handle it. I did not call Robert. I did not call the agency. I did not call Edmund. I drove out to the lake house the next morning, alone, and I let myself in with my key, and I stood in the front room and I looked at the dock through the picture window for a while. The board was still uneven. The thermos with the dent was still on the kitchen counter from the last time I had been up. The framed photograph of Helen on the porch in 1982 was still on the bookshelf, the one where she is laughing at something one of the children had said, and the light is coming through her hair the way it used to come through her hair on summer afternoons. Then I walked into the back bedroom, the one we used as an office, and I opened the bottom drawer of the old oak filing cabinet I bought from a courthouse auction in 1976. The deed had been in that drawer since 1987. It was still there. It had a piece of brown paper around it, and Helen's handwriting on the brown paper, in her small, careful hand, said simply, "Lake House, Walter only." I took the deed out, and I sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time, the way a man sits with a letter from someone who is gone. I did not cry. I had cried about Helen many times over many years, and that was not what this was. This was something else. This was the feeling a man has when the work he did when he was younger turns out to have been the right work, and he is grateful, in a quiet way, to the man he used to be. I did not change the deed that day. I did not need to. The deed was already correct. What I did that afternoon was call Edmund Jr. and ask him to send me a fresh copy of the full trust document with all the amendments by certified mail so that I would have it in front of me on paper the next time I needed it. He said he would have it on my desk by Monday. He did. I drove home with the deed back in the drawer where it belonged, and I locked the lake house door, and I did not say a word to Robert about any of it. That was the 3rd red flag, and that was the moment I knew that whatever was coming was already on its way. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn, and 1 document to teach. The winter went by, Christmas came. Robert and Caroline and Tyler drove down for the day. Margaret and her family came on Christmas Eve. The whole house smelled like the cinnamon Helen used to put in the coffee, because Margaret has Helen's recipe and uses it, and there is a kindness in the way certain smells outlive certain people. We exchanged gifts. Robert gave me a very nice pair of leather gloves, which I am wearing as I record this, and Caroline gave me a book about the Civil War that I have not yet finished. Tyler showed me something on his phone that I pretended to understand. Nobody mentioned the lake house. Robert did not mention his calls to Edmund. He had no reason to think I knew. I watched him over dinner, the way you watch a witness who is about to be asked a question you already know the answer to. He was easy. He was charming. He told a long story about a deal at his office that I think was meant to impress me, and did not exactly, but I laughed at the right places because he is my son. At one point, when Tyler had wandered off and Caroline was helping Margaret in the kitchen, Robert leaned across the table and said, "Dad, have you given any more thought to downsizing?" I said, "Downsizing what?" He said, "Well, the lake house mainly. You are not getting any younger. None of us are. It is a lot of upkeep for a place you only use a few weekends a year now." I said, "Your mother and I bought that place in 1978. He said, "I know that, Dad. I am just saying. There would be no shame in letting it go. The market is good right now. You could put the money in something that works for you." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Robert, I appreciate you thinking of me." Then I asked him to pass the rolls. He passed the rolls. The conversation moved on. But that was the moment I understood that the calls to Edmund had not been the end of his thinking. They had been the beginning. I want to tell you something else about that Christmas because I have thought about it a lot. After dinner, when Caroline and Margaret were doing the dishes and Tyler was on the back porch with his phone, Robert wandered into the small workshop off the garage where I keep my tools. I followed him in a few minutes later because I had heard him pick something up. He had my old level in his hand, the wooden one with the brass fittings that my own father gave me in 1962. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he is appraising. I said, "That level was your grandfather's." He said, "Oh." He set it back down on the bench. Then he said, "Dad, you should think about what you want to do with all this stuff. Eventually. While you can still decide." I said, "I have decided, Robert. It stays where it is." He nodded the way a man nods when he is choosing not to say what he is thinking. We walked back inside. He did not bring the workshop up again, but I stood at that bench for a long time the next morning, after he had gone home, and I picked up the level, and I checked it against the edge of the bench, and the bubble settled exactly where it has settled since 1962, dead center, between the two black lines. Some things are made well. They do not need to be replaced. They only need to be left alone. I want to tell you something about that exchange at the dinner table too, because I think it is important. He was not being cruel. He was being efficient. He was being the kind of man his profession had taught him to be. To him, the lake house was an asset that was underperforming. To me, it was the place where his sister learned to swim, and where his mother is buried in everything but the literal sense. Because if you walk out on the dock at sunset, you can still hear her telling Margaret to be careful and telling Robert to put on a shirt. He could not see what I saw. He had stopped looking for it. That was when I knew that whatever I did next, I would do without anger. The anger had already passed. What was left was the work. In January, I drove to Edmund's office in Charlottesville, and I sat with him for 2 hours, and we went over the trust line by line. I did not change a comma. I did not need to. Helen's fence held. What I did do was ask Edmund to put a small note in the file. If any inquiry comes in from any party other than the trustee about this property, the response is, all matters pertaining to this trust must be addressed through the named trustee directly, and no information may be released. Edmund said that was already his standing instruction. I said, "I know, Edmund. Put it in the file anyway." He smiled at me a little. He said, "You sound like your wife." I said, "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me this winter." February passed. The dogwood started to think about flowering. I went to the cemetery on the first Tuesday of February the way I always do, and I told Helen about Robert's question at Christmas, and I told her I had been to see Edmund, and I told her the fence was holding. I do not know if she heard me. I think she did. There are things a man knows that he cannot prove in a court of law, and that is one of them. Then March came, and the first Tuesday of March came, and I drove out to the cemetery in the morning with the thermos and the dented side, and I sat under the sycamore for a while, and the phone went off in my pocket. The day before, on the Monday, I had driven out to the lake house one more time. I do not know what made me go up there. A feeling, maybe. The kind of feeling a man learns to listen to after he has spent a few decades on the bench watching people lie. I let myself in with my key, and I stood in the front room, and the house was cold, the way it is cold in March before the heat catches up. The framed photograph of Helen on the porch in 1982 was still on the bookshelf. The thermos with the dent was still on the kitchen counter. Somebody had moved the small ceramic bowl on the dining room table about 6 inches to the left of where it usually sat. It was not much. It was the kind of thing only a man who had set a bowl in the same spot for 40 years would notice. I moved the bowl back. I did not say a word to anyone. I went home. I tell you that because I want you to understand. The walkthrough was not a surprise to me. The voicemail was a confirmation. By the time the agent's voice came through the speaker of my phone in the cemetery parking lot the next morning, the only thing I did not yet know was the price. You already know what was in the voicemail. I told you at the beginning. Polite young woman, professional voice, confirming the walkthrough at the lake house for Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield, for choosing our firm. We are looking forward to meeting the family. I sat in the truck after I listened to it, with my hand on the steering wheel, and I looked at the watch on my wrist. The long jeans. The one Helen gave me for our 30th in 1973. The second hand was doing what it does. 11 o'clock. The light was coming in through the windshield and falling on the watch face the way it falls on the face of a watch in the morning, and the small scratch on the crystal, the one from the winter I dropped it in the gravel of our driveway in 1991, was catching the sun. I sat there a long time. Then I started the truck and I drove home. I did not call Robert. I did not call him that day. I did not call him that week. I called Edmund. When Edmund picked up, I said, "Edmund, my son has listed the lake house. He has signed a listing agreement with a firm in Charlottesville. The walkthrough is Thursday. I would like you to do 4 things. I would like you to pull the trust documents and confirm what we both already know. I would like you to send a written notice to the listing agency that the listing is void on the face of it because the seller has no authority to sell. I would like you to copy that notice to my son. And I would like you to copy it to me." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, I am sorry." I said, "Edmund, do not be sorry. Helen built this fence for exactly this Tuesday. Just do the 4 things. He said he would have it done by the end of the day. He did. The deed had been in that drawer since 1987. It was still there. Now I want to tell you about the morning the attorney called back, because that is the part of the story I think about most. It was a Wednesday. I was in the kitchen. I had just finished breakfast. I had taken the watch off to wash the dish, the way I always do, because Helen taught me not to get a Longines wet if I did not have to, and the watch was sitting face up on the kitchen table next to the salt. The phone rang. It was Edmund. He said, "Walter, the agency has acknowledged the notice. They have removed the listing. The listing agreement is void. They have notified Robert in writing. Their position is that they were misled about the ownership and the authority to sell, and they will not be pursuing a commission. The walkthrough has been canceled. The matter is closed on their end." I thanked him. I asked him if Robert had been copied. Edmund said yes, copied yesterday afternoon. Edmund said, "Walter, you should expect a call." I said, "I expect I will get one." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. The watch was still face up next to the salt. I used to set my pen down that way on the bench before a verdict was read in my courtroom. I would put the pen down with the cap toward me and the nib away, and I would look at it for a moment, and then I would read what I had to read. I do not know why I started doing that. I think I picked it up from an older judge in my first year. I never stopped doing it. The watch was face up. The second hand was moving. The phone rang. It was Robert. I let it ring. Then I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message the first time. He called back 10 minutes later. I let that one ring too. The third time, about an hour later, he left a message. "I will not play it for you. I will tell you what was in it." He was upset. He was confused. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the agency had sent him a strange letter. He said, "Dad, can you please call me?" I need to understand what is happening. I did not call him back that day either. I want to be honest with you about that. It was not a strategy. I was not punishing him. I was simply not ready. A man my age does not pick up a phone before he is ready. I had been the one moving carefully for months while my son moved fast. I was not going to move fast now to make him feel better. I went to the cemetery the next morning, even though it was not the first Tuesday. I sat on the bench under the sycamore and I told Helen what had happened. I told her about the voicemail, and I told her about the 4 things, and I told her about the watch on the kitchen table. I told her her fence had held. I sat there for about an hour. Then I drove home and I called my son. I will not pretend the conversation was easy. It was not. He was not ready to be the man he needed to be in that conversation, and I was not going to make him be that man before he was ready. He started by telling me there had been a misunderstanding. I let him say that. He said the agency had given him bad information. I let him say that too. He said he had only been trying to look out for me, that he had been worried about the upkeep, that he had not meant for it to go this far. I let him say all of it. When he was done, I said, "Robert." He said, "Yes." I said, "Your mother and I bought that place in 1978. He said, "I know, Dad." I said, "Your mother filed the trust in 1989, 4 months before her diagnosis. The trustee is me. The conditions are clear. You received a copy of the document in December of 1990. You and your sister both did. I sat with you in this kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, and I went over it with you, and I asked you if you had any questions. You said you would read it later." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I never read it." I said, "I know, Robert." He said, "Dad, I am sorry." I said, "I know that too." We were quiet for a while. There is a kind of silence between a father and a grown son that is different from any other silence I know. It is not empty. It is full of all the things you have not said in 20 years. After a while I said, "Robert, I am not going to argue with you about this. I am not going to fight with you about it. I am not going to take you out of the trust because your mother put you in the trust, and what your mother did stands. But I am going to ask you one thing. I am going to ask you to drive down here this Saturday, by yourself, without Caroline, without Tyler, and sit in the kitchen with me for an hour and read the document." He said he would come. He came. He sat at this table. I put the document in front of him, and I put a glass of water beside the document, and I went out on the back porch, and I let him read it. It took him about 40 minutes. When he came out on the porch, he had the document in his hand and his eyes were red, and he sat down in the chair next to me, the one Helen used to sit in, and he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Dad, why did Mom do this?" I said, "Because she loved you, Robert. And because she knew you, and because she wanted, if it ever came to it, for the answer to be on paper, so that you and I would not have to be the ones to say it." He said, "I am embarrassed." I said, "I know. That will pass. The lake house will not." He sat with that for a while. The light was going down behind the dogwood. The watch was on my wrist again. The second hand was doing what it does. After a while, he said, "Dad, what happens now?" I said, "What happens now is you go home and you tell Caroline what happened and you tell her honestly because she deserves it. And you and I keep going to that lake house together for as many summers as we have left. And when I am gone, the trust does what your mother told it to do. And the lake house stays in this family. And Tyler and his children, if he has them, will get to learn what an uneven board on a dock feels like under a bare foot at sunset. That is what happens now." He nodded. He did not try to defend himself. He did not try to make it small. He sat with it, the way a man sits with a thing when he is finally ready to. "I will tell you one more thing, and then I will be done." That night, after Robert drove back to Richmond, I sat in this kitchen alone, and I took the watch off and I put it face up on the table next to the salt, the way I had on the morning Edmund called. I looked at it for a long time. The second hand was moving. The small scratch on the crystal was catching the light from the lamp the way it has been catching light for 35 years. Helen gave it to me on a Sunday afternoon in 1973. She had saved for it. She had not told me she was saving for it. She handed it to me in a small box wrapped in brown paper, and she said, "Walter, you spend so much time looking at that old courthouse clock. I thought you should have a clock of your own. I have looked at that watch 10,000 times. I looked at it in the cemetery parking lot when the voicemail played. I looked at it the morning Edmund called to say the listing was void. I looked at it that night, alone, after my son had gone home. I am going to tell you something an old man learns, if he is paying attention. The work you do when you are young, the careful work, the slow work, the work nobody thanks you for at the time, that work is what holds the line for the people you love when you are no longer in the room." Helen built a fence in 1989 when she was sick and frightened and clear-eyed because she had thought about what could happen and she had decided to do something about it. She did the work. The fence held. I am not angry at my son. I love him. I will love him until the day I am buried next to his mother under that sycamore. He made a bad mistake. He has owned it. He will not make it again. But I want any of you watching who are my age, who have been told you are slow, or that you are forgetful, or that you are not quite up to the modern way of doing things, who have been talked across at dinner tables, who have heard your own children say anymore in a voice that was not quite low enough. I want you to hear me when I say this. You are not weak because you are old. You are not done because you are tired. The records you kept when you were 35 are still where you put them. The deeds your wives helped you sign in 1989 are still on file. The watches your wives gave you in 1973 still keep time. The fences you built when nobody was watching are still standing, in the dark, while you sleep. Old hands still know where the records are kept. And if stories like this remind you that quiet elders are not helpless, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes the oldest person in the room remembers the most important truth. I am going to go put the thermos on the counter now. The first Tuesday of April is coming.